Welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. A retrial is underway in one of Slovakia's most politically disturbing cases, the killing of journalist Ján Kuciak and his fiancée. Now, his reporting on high-level corruption shook the country and sparked mass protests that brought down a government. Now, nearly 8 years later, the man accused of ordering the murder is back in court. What does it say about justice, democracy, and press freedom in the region? Joining us today on TVP World is Grigorij Mesežnikov, president of the Slovakian Institute for Public Affairs, prominent voice on democratic backsliding and civic activism in Central Europe. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much for having me. Good morning.
So can you help us set the stage and explain to our viewers how did this murder case trigger such a massive public reaction in Slovakia?
Yes, really, this case is absolutely iconic for Slovakia, the case of the trial, but also the case of the murder. Because when Ján Kuciak and his fiancée Martina Kušnírová, when they were murdered, it really led to the street revolution in Slovakia. The hundreds of thousands of people came to the streets in the squares and demanding not only the investigation of this terrible crime, but also the change in conducting the power. And Robert Fico, first time in Slovak history, modern history, was forced to resign, and the government was changed. And then 2 years later, the party of Robert Fico lost elections. Since that time, this investigation was ongoing, and there were two court trials on the specialized tribunal in Slovakia, and both verdicts were cancelled by Supreme Court. So today it's a retrial. It's de facto the third trial. According to Slovak law, if Supreme Court is returning the case to the special tribunal, and not only return to the tribunal, but also return to the different Senate, it means that the whole process is now starting from beginning. So today it's a test of functionality of Slovak judiciary, efficiency, and impartiality.
All right, speaking of effectiveness of the court and its impartiality, of course, like you mentioned, Fico's government was brought down because of the case, but now with Fico back in power, is there any concern about pressure on the courts or institutions?
I think that this case is so spectacular that even if somebody from the government would try to influence the decision of the court, if they would do this, it will immediately be met with the protests, with the criticism, and I think that this process, despite the fact that 2 times the case was returned to the special tribunal, nevertheless, I think that it's a good example of functionality of the court and court system. So politically, it's a very sensitive issue. The main suspect, Marián Kočner, who was de facto released by the previous decision of the special tribunal, it's a person quite personally close to Robert Fico. They lived in the same address, in the same building, and this person tried to influence political development in Slovakia, including that time the ruling parties. So it's so important trial, and the attention is attracted to this trial in really unbelievable high degree. So any efforts to influence politically this trial, I think, would have the counterproductive effect for those who would try to do this.
Right, so instead of directly pressuring these courts or institution, we are also seeing the utilization of this political sensitivity that you mentioned just earlier, where Fico is now trying to paint this as a more political issue rather than just facts on the ground. Do you think that that would be successful once polarization sets in? The actual facts of the case would get a little bit muddied?
Well, of course, there are some elements of politicization in perception of what happened and what is happening, and Robert Fico is still trying to present the alternative versions of what happened. According to his initial interpretation, it was intentional effort to weaken his government in 2018. But the investigation didn't reveal any such occurrences, and all evidences and testimonies were absolutely clear that Ján Kuciak was murdered because of his work of investigatory journalist. So no any special efforts to overthrow the government, but the real criminal case which was related with activities of the independent journalist. Unfortunately, Robert Fico is still trying to reinterpret the whole case. Quite recently, after some files, so-called Epstein files, were publicized, he tried to reverse the main version of what happened and try to create this feeling that there were some clandestine activities from abroad which allegedly organized the whole case. But I think that concerning the investigation, such unbelievably big number of testimonies were collected by investigators and prosecutors that to reinterpret in such manner the whole case, I think it's absolutely undoable thing.
Right. And now going back to this case, like I mentioned earlier, this has actually brought down Fico's government, forced him to resign, and subsequently the opposition party was voted into power. But a couple of years later, we see Robert Fico back in power again. What does that say about the political climate within the country?
Well, it's very telling concerning the vulnerability of democratic process, including elections. And Robert Fico really returned to power, but in the context of what happened after this murder, because Slovakia was faced as neighboring countries in the whole world with many events, many trends, which changed mood of the population and voting behavior. Don't forget about influence of COVID, which really quite substantially impacted the political setup in Slovakia, attitude of people to what is happening socially. Then, of course, Russian-Ukrainian war also impacted the situation, influx of Ukrainian refugees, the rise of nationalism, xenophobia. So all these factors helped to Robert Fico to return to power, but it wasn't only his electoral victory. Three parties of the current ruling coalitions decided to form this government. So Robert Fico alone wouldn't win the real power. But unfortunately, some politicians in Slovakia forgot about what happened 5 years ago and agreed to form the coalition with Robert Fico. But I have to say that this government is failing in deliverance. The promises of affordability of social services, healthcare system, good living conditions, I think government is failing in this, but even maybe more importantly, and it's really, it meets the criticism and still meets the criticism of the population. Robert Fico and his government is changing the pro-Western foreign policy orientation. Slovakia is not a part of the so-called coalition of willing, and Slovakia is less supportive concerning the Ukraine. So there are expectations that in the next elections, Robert Fico will not be enough successful to get the power again.
All right, very quick, we have a little bit of time, but last but not least, do you think that anything has really changed in Slovakia's fight against high-level corruption since 2018?
Well, there is a quite broad coalition of actors which are fighting against corruption. The opposition parties, they are presenting their criticism, but also civil society and many actors, whistleblowers, civic activists, independent media. So Slovakia has a potential to overcome all these corrupt practices, which de facto led to the murder of Ján Kuciak. And I think it will be very important how, the new court new Senate will decide about this case, what will be the verdict. I think that if verdict will be adequate to what happened in Slovakia, it will be a very encouraging impulse for all people in Slovakia who are for democracy, against corruption, and for pro-Western orientation.
Right, so definitely this case could be seen as a turning point for the country as well. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much. It was my big pleasure.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.